Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Maritime Historical Society's seminar series. We are so fortunate to have with us this evening author, illustrator, and Sea History Magazine contributor Richard King, presenting his book, Ahab's Rolling Sea, A Natural History of Moby-Dick. My name is Jessica McFarlane, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Before I introduce our president, Birchnell Green, and Sea History editor, Deirdre O'Regan, please allow me to tell you a bit about the format for tonight's presentation. Richard will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes and sharing a slideshow on your screens. For the best sound quality for all our attendees this evening, we ask that you do not unmute your audio. As is our custom for our seminars, the last 15 minutes or so will be reserved for questions and answers. You may type questions into the Zoom chat feature, and they will be read to Richard at the end of the presentation. You can find the chat button on the bottom menu of your computer screen or under More if you are participating on a smartphone. At the end of the Q&A, we'll open the floor and give participants the opportunity to unmute themselves and catch up with friends and acquaintances in the room. So without further ado, please welcome NMHS President Birchnell Green.
It is a privilege to welcome you to our first virtual seminar and to have great attendance from around the country. We encourage you all to follow up this visit with frequent trips to our website, www.seahistory.org, where you will uncover a treasure chest of resources and materials for all ages. I welcome our chairman, Ronald Oswald, our vice chairman, Rick Lopes, and our trustees, Walter Brown, Dr. Timothy Runyon, and Jean Wart, whose leadership has kept us on course in these most turbulent and difficult days. We welcome the chairs of our seminar steering committee, Lou Leotti and Dr. Ray Phillips. There is a most distinguished group of you guests this evening, and you are very welcome. Our moderator host is our Director of Development, Web Guru, and Vice President, Jessica McFarlane. Jessica's incredible talents at communications have made her indispensable, as is our indefatigable editor of Sea History, Deirdre O'Regan. Her background on tall ships as a professional mariner, her MA in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, the hundreds of articles on all fields of our maritime heritage she wrote and edited, her field work in nautical archaeology, documenting several shipwrecks, her active participation in many of the organizations in our field, like the North American Society of Oceanic History, the American Society of Marine Artists, Tall Ships America, the Council of American Maritime Marine Museums, and International Congress of Maritime Museums.
You're good.
I just want to say I'm thrilled that Rich is here. I can't remember when I first met Rich, but most likely I had heard about him before I actually met him, because at the time we were both sailing as crew members and educators on traditionally rigged sailing ships, all of which were in some capacity or another involved in educational programming. But since that time, Rich has taught hundreds, and actually probably more like thousands of students now, both ashore and at sea. He's written 4 books and too many magazine and journal articles to count. Plus he's illustrated 2 children's books on maritime topics. He's worked as a sternman on lobster boats, sailed alone across the Atlantic, and he got his PhD along the way from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. But most familiar to Sea History readers is his regular feature in our Sea History for Kids section called Animals in Sea History, which he both writes and illustrates. After a couple of decades teaching with the Williams Mystic program at Mystic Seaport Museum, he's now a visiting associate professor with the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which operates 2 sailing research vessels, one in the Atlantic and one in the Pacific. The subject of today's Zoom presentation is his latest book, Ahab's Rolling Sea, A Natural History of Moby-Dick, which in a way is the culmination of a lot of what Rich has been studying and writing and teaching about for most of his adult life. So welcome, Rich, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dee, and Birchie and Jessica, and all of you for spending a little time with me tonight. I really encourage you to ask questions and put those in the chat. And also, if you can't hear me, or I feel like already the lighting's a little weird as the sun sets here, I'm in Mystic, Connecticut. And so please communicate over the chat. I won't see it, but Dee will see it, and she'll kind of collect all those questions. And if we don't get to questions and comments, all of them at the end, then I'll really be excited to hear from you over email or continue the discussion in other ways. All right, let's get started then. I'm going to share my screen. And so you should be seeing a opening slide. And so if you're not, communicate over the chat to get a little help. And so what I want to talk about is this book project that I've been working on. And the book's called Ahab's Rolling Sea, A Natural History of Moby-Dick. And I sort of have 3 points that I want to make today. The first one is that Herman Melville had a unique perspective as a sailor, an author, and a self-taught natural theologian. And many of you know about him as a sailor and all the experience that Herman Melville had. We know that he was a reader and a writer and really cared about putting together exquisite prose. But we also need to think about Herman Melville writing Moby-Dick in 1851, just 8 years before On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And so Melville writes a lot about faith in Moby-Dick, as many of you know that have read the novel. But not all of it is ironic. He's certainly grappling with faith, but he's very much in a school of, say, Emerson or Louis Agassiz, that we might call natural theology, meaning that he is trying to square the teachings of the Bible with all the sort of revolution in scientific knowledge that have really just come up in the 1820s and 1830s about extinction and knowledge of the age of the earth. The second point that I want to make is about Herman Melville's 19th century perception of the ocean, and in some ways how it's really the same today. So I wanted to use Moby-Dick as a benchmark, not just for marine biology and oceanography, but sort of how we thought about the ocean in the 19th century, how we perceive that space. And in many ways, it's really still the same, sometimes perpetuated by novels like Moby-Dick, but there's one sort of crucial facet that no longer exists, or that Melville really could never imagine. And that's one of my teasers. And so we'll get to that as we move along, what that facet would be. And the third is thinking about Moby-Dick in the 21st century and how we read the novel in ways that Herman Melville could never have imagined. And one of those is thinking about Ishmael as a climate refugee. And when we get to that third point, I'm actually going to read a selection from my book. Most writers are better writers than speakers. And I just wanted to kind of give you a little flavor of what I wrote, as well as to try to, get the words a little bit more precise. But let's first start with Herman Melville as a sailor, author, and self-taught natural theologian. And many of you know the Charles W. Morgan here on the slide here, and really recognize that the Charles W. Morgan is just this super important artifact for American literature. It was just so close to the vessel that Herman Melville sailed on aboard the Acushnet. So this is a map that we put together for the book. Aaron Greb is this amazing cartographer. And the solid line is what we can put together in terms of the Pequod, the clues that Herman Melville gives us, or Ishmael gives us, about the voyage. And then these other dotted lines show Melville's voyages before he wrote Moby-Dick. And so it's really important to recognize that Melville had really been to sea and spent a lot of time at sea before he wrote Moby-Dick. He'd been transatlantic twice, once as a crew member and once as a passenger. And then he went on this enormous odyssey of a voyage from 1841 to 1844, where he sailed on 3 different whale ships and 1 American man of war. And the primary whale ship was the Acushnet, which left out of New Bedford and was built really within 6 months of the Charles W. Morgan, only a few miles away. And so it's almost exactly like the Charles W. Morgan, also on its maiden voyage. And Melville sailed all the way around Cape Horn on this whale ship. And then he made his way to the Marquesas Islands. And one thing that Aaron couldn't do as a cartographer is show this route here from the Galapagos to the Marquesas. This took about 4.5 months. And so if you were a mariner today, or even on a ship like the Charles W. Morgan, you could make that passage in a few weeks. But they took 4.5 months just zigging and zagging back and forth the equator looking for whales. And I think it's really important to think, and I don't think it's entirely hyperbolic to suggest that we have never in the history of humans, and we never will again, send so many people out to sea on a regular basis to just slowly, quietly observe the surface of the ocean. So we're talking about from the 1830s to 1850s, sometimes over 600 whaling ships per year out at sea. And so we're talking 10,000 people out at sea, standing up aloft 2 hours a day, just slowly watching the surface of the sea, day after day after day. And it is perhaps no accident that when Melville gets to the Marquesas, that's when he jumps ship. He'd spent about 6 months from Peru to the Marquesas, and maybe they anchored a couple times in the Galapagos, but really without seeing any proper port for an entire half year. So that doesn't mean that necessarily every mariner that went to sea, just like every fisherman today, wasn't, a future Charles Darwin or Rachel Carson. But the very vicinity that these people had day after day, it was this sort of really important hunter's knowledge. And some of the whalemen really were interested in natural history. And so this is a famous image from a logbook, a commonplace book by Dean Wright, which is held at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And this was just a regular sailor who made his own sort of nonfiction book, and he painted all these different images. You got your mola mola there, your hammerhead, a couple different types of billfish, a right whale, a pilot whale, and he had all these wonderful descriptions of the specimens that he saw and observed firsthand and incorporated what he had read. This image by Robert Weir, he was a trained artist. He came from a family of artists, and this logbook is held at Mystic Seaport. And that's actually the head of a sperm whale there. So a smaller sperm whale, a female or juvenile, they could actually bring the head up on the deck. And so those are the men actually sitting inside the head of the sperm whale, bucketing out that spermaceti waxy oil that was so valuable. One of the things that I did with Ahab's Rolling Sea was to interview current scientists, marine biologists, oceanographers, geologists, and to look back at what Melville wrote. And one thing that really struck me was that modern marine biologists have very little physical connection or a tactile experience with whales. It's not a sperm whale biologist's job to touch living whales today. But the whalemen like Herman Melville, they would touch a living whale perhaps once a month if things were going well, and actually even do a dissection down through the blubber layer. And so it was a very different experience that these whalemen had, this kind of true hunter's knowledge. And Ishmael, of course, was really quite proud of that. A whale ship was my Yale College and Harvard. And he says later, that I have had to do with whales with these visible hands. He's really interested in that sort of showing that he is different than the closet naturalists ashore who haven't had that actual sailor's experience. This experience wasn't just from cutting in whales or from those 2-hour shifts up on the masthead. It was also in small boats. And many of you know that the Charles W. Morgan went out to Stellwagen Bank in 2014. And the staff from the seaport even launched one of the whale boats. So that whale boat's about 30 foot long for scale. Those are a couple humpbacks. And so you can get a sense of scale. And imagine, sperm whales sometimes can dive for over an hour at a time. And so the whaleman in the middle of the equatorial Pacific would be sitting in that whaleboat, just waiting quietly, with 5 of your closest friends, and just waiting and sitting quietly. No engines, no fans, just watching the surface of the sea. And Melville writes in Mardi, which is a novel that he wrote 2 years before Moby-Dick, that really has a lot of the themes that he's kind of working through before he gets to Moby-Dick. And he writes, I commend the student of ichthyology to an open boat and the ocean moors of the Pacific. As your craft glides along, what strange monsters float by. Elsewhere was never seen their like, and nowhere are they found in the books of the naturalists. So again, there he's sort of poking those who haven't been to sea and seen the things that the whalemen or the fishermen have seen in real life for themselves. Moby-Dick is not just about whales, of course. And so what I did was looked at all the scenes throughout the novel, and Melville writes about albatross and paper nautilus and bioluminescence. Those are the dinoflagellates at the lower left. Pip, the castaway, is floating above those colossal orbs, those big Porrites corals. And we've got the magnificent frigate bird, or a species of frigate bird, and that's the skyhawk, the sea hawk that comes in at the end of Moby-Dick. I also like this slide too to kind of remind us that Moby-Dick really is a book about the ocean, and I love all the interpretations, whether it's about capitalism, fascism, race, gender, Milton, Shakespeare. Moby-Dick is so rich with so many experiences and ways to read the novel. But for me personally, it's foremost a living novel about the ocean. There are very few novels out there that spend so much time at sea. And it's also important to remember, just from the whaler's perspective, and I know we kind of all know this, but we don't really think about it, that, Melville and all his whaleman contemporaries did not see the South Pacific, in black and white etchings, right? They looked over their small boats and saw those coral reefs. They saw those albatross. They saw the gular pouches, that big red puffy gular pouch of the frigate bird. And so they experienced a world in extraordinary color, in a way that we are far more prepared to do in an age of color photography and documentaries like Blue Planet. There are sea lions and seals in Moby-Dick. There's the pilot fish around the sharks. And of course, sharks have a really big part in Moby-Dick, because whalemen on a regular basis would see all of these sharks that were basically scavenging on the whale carcasses that the whalemen had brought alongside their boats. This photograph was taken by Chris Fallows, who is both a sort of marine biologist as well as a photographer, and he takes ecotourists out to see sharks off the coast of South Africa. And like I did with a lot of these scenes, I asked Chris, hey, how do you read these scenes in Moby-Dick? And one thing that really struck him was the way that Ishmael describes the sound of the sharks crunching into the carcass of the whale. And he said, for him, and he's only been able to see it just a couple times in his life by chance, it was just such an extraordinary experience to hear that sound. And another shark expert, David Ebert at Moss Landing in California, also described how accurate some of Melville's descriptions were when it came to sharks. Melville also wrote about squid, of course. Those of you that have read the novel know about that scene of the giant squid, this enormous white, scary floating thing on the surface. And this image at the upper left is of Marta Garabobo, who is off. She just finished her PhD and she studies sperm whale ecology. And so we were off the Kaikoura Canyon coast in New Zealand. And I love this photograph so much. And it's not in the book. And it's one of those things where I don't know why we cut that in the end. But so I was so lucky to go out with Marta, and she took me out in her small boat. And what she would do is when a sperm whale dove, she would take the boat over the foot that the sperm whale had left and try to collect little pieces of skin that she could analyze to understand what the whales were eating. But every once in a long while, she would get super lucky. And I was so lucky to be on at this one moment when actually a big hunk of squid was floating on the surface. And those two little holes right there, those are sperm whale teeth marks, right? So the sperm whale had literally just been a sloppy eater, and a big hunk of that squid had floated up. Now, probably not a giant squid, probably a warty squid, Marta thought. So there were at the time that Melville was writing Moby-Dick in the 1850s, there were no Western illustrations of giant squid or the really colossal squids or the large squid. They just were unknown in the scientific literature. It was the whalemen who had these experiences. And Melville has this kind of little subtle moment, if you know what's going on, where in that scene with the giant squid, it's Starbuck, the first mate, this pious, experienced whaleman, and he's so freaked out by that squid. And he just says, this is a bad omen, we got to get out of here. But Queequeg, the Pacific Islander hero, says, whatever, it's just a squid. When you see a big squid, you're going to see sperm whales right after. And lo and behold, that's exactly what Melville does. The next active scene, we see sperm whales that have come up. And the whalemen knew about this. They knew they had seen, and this is a little gruesome, but in a fight, they saw sperm whales vomit up pieces of squid. And when they cut up a sperm whale, they would have seen squid arms and squid parts. And so they knew very well that the whales ate squid. They understood that from their diet. The whalemen, at least as far as I can tell, and maybe if someone knows better and they can point it out in the chat, the whalemen knew that these sort of scratch marks, and this is a sperm whale alongside upside down, that these scratch marks could come from other sperm whales, but they didn't know at the time, at least I haven't been able to find yet, any sources that would have connected this to kind of the talons of some of those large squid or some of the sucker marks or things like that. So they knew that they were eating squid, but they didn't know that a lot of these markings on the sperm whale could have come from their predation on squid. This is one of my favorite photographs, and this is from Tony Wu, and he basically sort of donated this photograph to the project. He's a very well-known National Geographic photographer, and this photograph is so compelling in so many ways. I'm sure you all could sit and look at it forever. He's diving underwater there. He doesn't have scuba equipment. That's a big cloud of defecation up there at the right of the photograph. And all these sperm whales are sloughing socially. So they're actually all kind of rubbing together, kind of rubbing refreshing their skin. It's just an amazing photograph. And to me, it really evokes that Grand Armada scene in Moby-Dick. And Tony and I have been lucky. I've been lucky to be able to correspond with him because he's been really interested in historical superpods of whales, and the 19th century whalemen were some of the few people to really describe seeing these enormous pods of whales out in the deep sea. So that was a pretty long-winded way of me to kind of talk about Melville as a sailor and an author and kind of what his experience was out at sea in terms of natural history. That second point I wanted to get to is Melville's perception of the ocean and how that might be the same or different than how we see the ocean today. And those of us that like to vacation near the water, or how we think about climate change, or just kind of how we think about the ocean in our daily and cultural lives. I think the best example of that is this little chapter called Brit, which is actually right before the Squid chapter. And what's happening here in the novel, and I'll try not too many spoilers in our discussion, you know, if you haven't read the novel or haven't read it in a while, but this one isn't really a spoiler. The Pequod is coming around the Cape of Good Hope. They just entered the Indian Ocean, and they encounter all these right whales, the baleen whales that are just skim feeding on the surface. And Ishmael, at this point, they don't want to hunt these whales. They're more interested in the sperm whales. And he compares these right whales to elephants or even rocks. And this is just a prairie. The surface of the water is covered with brit, which was a whaleman's word for plankton, zooplankton, or krill that the right whales would feed upon. And so it's a sort of really quiet, almost pastoral scene. And then all of a sudden it's like, it just sort of like scratches the record. He's like, you know what? Actually, the sea and the land are totally different. And so he gives this one sentence. And so, you know, English teachers, you know, put your hands over your ears for the run-on that's about to come. But it's a really extraordinary sentence that we can look at and say, okay, this is how one author that as an artifact that is describing the human relationship with the ocean in the 1850s. And so I'm going to read this, and I highlighted in white some images, some I think are really relevant to how we think about the ocean, and sum up what he says. So this is in the chapter Brit. But though to landsmen in general, the native inhabitants of the seas have ever been regarded with emotions unspeakably unsocial and repelling, though we know the sea to be an everlasting terra incognita, so that Columbus sailed over numberless unknown worlds to discover his one superficial western one, though by vast odds, the most terrific of all mortal disasters have immemorially and indiscriminately befallen tens and hundreds of thousands of those who've gone upon the waters, though but a moment's consideration will teach that however baby man may brag of his science and skill, and however much in a flattering future that science and skill may augment, yet for ever and forever to the crack of doom, the sea will insult and murder him and pulverize the stateliest, stiffest frigate he can make. Nevertheless, by the continual repetition of these very impressions, man has lost that sense of the full awfulness of the sea, which aboriginally belongs to it. So that's one of my favorite sentences from the novel, which I think does a nice job of summarizing how Melville, through Ishmael and Moby-Dick, perceives the ocean. And so for much of 19th century America, the ocean was immortal and vast and indifferent and violent. And I pose to you all out there that we sort of think about it the same way today, just sort of for different reasons. Right now, we're kind of thinking about sea level rise. We're thinking about increasing hurricane intensity. We're thinking about tsunami. And we still kind of think about that ocean as immortal and vast. I'm even thinking, Dee, about the cover of the most recent Sea History magazine. And Ishmael begins with some of those ways that we also think the same way, of full of wonders, and it's spiritually nourishing. The thing that Melville did not foresee in the 1850s is an inexhaustible sea. He saw it as inexhaustible. He saw extinction. He saw anthropogenic deforestation. He saw the buffalo. He saw the loss of large predators on land, but he believed the ocean to be a wild, untouchable space that men could never, or humans could never impact. So the idea of kind of a save the ocean, or that we would be stewards of the ocean, to Melville, that would have been, somewhere between heretical and comical. that was not a world that he could imagine where the ocean would want our saving, or, you know, or that we would think that we would be saving the ocean. And it's not an accident that Melville ends the novel, and this is the Barry Moser edition, my favorite illustrated edition, with, you know, the sea bats last. You know, we end with the sea, which is, and he kind of makes a biblical reference, even though at this time he knows, has more of a sense of the true age of the earth. But he knows or posits that the sea is going to live on beyond human concerns and civilization. So the third point I wanted to make was to kind of try out a little bit this idea of, you know, how do we read a novel that's so important and so huge in our culture today, like Moby-Dick, and try to think of any other novel that is so often referenced in the popular media, and yet how many have actually read it. But I love this quotation, each age one may predict will find its own symbols in Moby-Dick. And Paul Lauder, you know, a half century later, as is perhaps always the case with the critics of the 1920s, tell us more about them than about him. And so, you know, like any classic work, just like Shakespeare or any works that we continually revisit, we put on new layers of meaning. And so I want to talk a little bit about the idea that we can read Ishmael in 2020 as a climate refugee. This is an image from 2017 that I took, and that is the Robert C. Seamans to the right. I teach, as Dee mentioned, I teach occasionally with the Sea Education Association, and we're on a trip to the Phoenix Islands protected area, which is part of the nation of Kiribati. And we're on the island of Canton, and those are crew members and students cleaning up the beach. I would spend about 2 hours a day on this trip when I wasn't doing the things I was supposed to be doing, just up aloft, watching and trying to replicate a little of that sense of like, okay, what was it like to go up and stand aloft 2 hours a day and watch and look for whales. So this is from Ahab's Rolling Sea, the last chapter. When I stood aloft in the middle of the South Pacific, aboard the Robert C. Seamans, I imagined Ishmael floating, thirsty, hypothermic, perhaps resigned, still passive, still inquiring, still philosophical. He is now a lesson for environmental conservation. Though open-minded, scholarly, and often funny, Ishmael is not a typical environmental hero. Ishmael is not the Lorax. Ishmael advocates no position. Ishmael takes no action to try to correct injustice. In her fable, The Afterlife of Ishmael, Margaret Atwood wrote that Ishmael had sinned by doing nothing. Ishmael, however, chosen by chance, but taking on the challenge in full, does at least bear witness to the tragic events. A new ancient mariner, he tells his tale, preaching against arrows, against harpoons, slung at the ocean and at its animals. Perhaps Ishmael convinces us to love all creatures great and small, from sperm whale to Brit. Perhaps it really doesn't even matter whether you believe the creatures to be the creations of God or not. Sometimes during my hours aloft looking for whales, students came up to talk with me, or we had conversations looking over the rail or in our classes on the quarterdeck. Since my first teaching position aboard the Concordia, that was 1993, undergraduate perceptions seem, taken crudely and on the whole, to have shifted toward focusing activist energies on issues of social justice, not so much on the innate rates of animals or the type of environmentalism of the Earth Day variety with which I was raised. After years of in-class debates about commercial and indigenous whaling, it seems the rising generations see the Save the Whales movement as mostly quaint, even nearing naive, despite research that continues to reveal even more intelligence in marine mammals, advanced age, and evidence of social behaviors that we can only name as aspects of culture. Saving whales purely for their own sake, for their own intrinsic individual worth is not the driving force of the newest environmentalism. For most of the students I've met, it's usually not enough to make economic or policy sacrifices to save a whale for the animal's life or well-being alone. Yes, it's awful to murder the whales in Moby-Dick, but what also about the cruelty imposed on Tashtigo as a Native American, Dagu as an African, Vidala as a Southeast Asian Middle Eastern fantasy, or the human hero in the story Quag, the Pacific Islander. The face of environmentalism in Moby-Dick for the next generation is not the sperm whale, but Pip or the harpooners. Students today are more inclined to support indigenous rights to hunt whales, for example, and to embrace Iceland or Norway or Japan's claim to hunt whales if these nations can defend their claims to cultural necessity. Just as Ishmael teaches, the new generation has learned to tune into the gray areas, to not rank humans or non-human animals, and as a colleague who regularly runs the debates puts it, quote, students reel a bit from the cultural imperialism. The rising generation wants a collective environmentalism without one culture telling another what to do. So in many ways today, the face of the climate change crisis and the ocean is often not the polar bear or even the harp seal, but and the Inuit way of life. We know that the Pequod ends somewhere near the equator when they meet the white whale, but it's sort of under debate sort of what longitude. Ishmael never really gives us a longitude, and I think it's reasonable to suggest that maybe it's closer to the wreck of the whale ship Essex to the far eastern Pacific. I like to think because of the amount of time that elapsed, that it's actually closer to the current day region of Kiribati. Now, that's where we were sailing that summer with the Robert C. Seamans. Though we wanted the waters and beaches of Kiribati to be an untouched antediluvian Eden, we learned that the people throughout the island nation of Kiribati see themselves as the front line of climate change. The approximately 113,000 citizens of Kiribati, most of whom live on the island of Tarawa, have had absolutely nothing to do with creating this global crisis. The Republic is made up now of 33 islands, 2 small uninhabited islands, effectively disappeared under the sea in 1999. Most of the islands than 1.2 statute miles wide, with an average height of 6 feet above sea level. This island nation is one of the most vulnerable to anthropogenic climate change. The shallow water sources are already at risk of sewage contamination. The citizens of Kiribati will almost certainly, in our children's lifetimes, represent one of the first, if not the first, entire nations to be without a claim to land. For the first time in recorded human history, a people, an entire culture, will be a stateless republic of climate change refugees, of Ishmaels. The former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, supported the establishment of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area for conservation measures. This was where we were sailing to do some baseline biological and oceanographic research. Evidence from other reserves around the world suggests that the ocean ecosystem, both inside and outside the reserve, will improve enormously and quickly. President Tong saw an opportunity to elevate awareness of his country on the world stage and to increase revenue from fishing rights that will likely become more valuable just outside the reserve boundaries. In addition, Tong allocated a large portion of his nation's budget to purchase land in Fiji to be reserved for future emigration. Migration with dignity were his rallying words. He led a variety of initiatives, such as planting mangroves around their coasts and creating economic and educational incentives for young Kiribati to establish roots in countries abroad. Tong wrote, quote, "Yet the people of Kiribati recognize that they are still stewards of the ocean that now threatens their way of life." So put your talons into that steward word. this essential idea would be foreign to Melville or Ahab or Ishmael or Noah, that the ocean in all its fury and force would need or welcome human stewardship. Imagine someone from the 1850s understanding this idea that humans could actually adjust the very sea level of the entire global ocean on average, the very chemistry of the ocean, the very temperature of the ocean by our actions. During our voyage, we learned what we assumed was excellent news. This is 2017, that the president of Fiji had declared officially that his nation would welcome those from Kiribati. One of our students aboard was Kiribati Waisong, a citizen of Kiribati who was studying biology in New Zealand and came aboard with us on the Robert C. Seamans as a student. The Fijians looked down on us, she explained. She had visited Fiji several times. If in a restaurant Fijians learn she is from Kiribati, they serve her differently. The international attention that Kiribati has received as a face of climate change as victims has turned out to be a mixed blessing. I don't want to go live in Fiji, Waisong told me. Up at the masthead, I began to think of Ishmael and Moby-Dick as a climate refugee, of which there are now tens of millions of people on Earth. In the Bible, Ishmael is an orphan, an unwanted castaway, who goes on to found a new religion. Groups of people from Louisiana to Papua New Guinea have already been permanently relocated because of sea level rise. During our voyage to the equatorial Pacific, as during every long trip at sea, seabirds were the most visible fauna. We observed and counted boobies, tropic birds, and terns. It was the frigate birds, however, which were by far the most dynamic fauna that we saw consistently throughout the trip. Even over Pango Pango Harbor in American Samoa, frigate birds soared over the water and up over the volcanic peaks. Sometimes near the island, frigate birds swooped threateningly low and close, while other times when I was aloft, I saw them in the distance at truly stunning heights, mere specks flying higher than I'd ever seen any bird, floating up at elevations it appeared far into the clouds. And remember, the frigate bird is the skyhawk and the seahawk at the end of Moby-Dick. When I was aloft at the masthead one morning near Enderbury Island, a frigate bird swooped down and pecked at the radio antenna at the tip of our foremast, only an arm's length away from me. I could have grabbed him if I had the courage, or a helmet. The nation of Kiribati declared independence from British rule in 1979. They designed a flag that consists of a blue sea, a stylized yellow sun on a red sky, and a bird, which is meant to be a frigate bird. According to Kiribati historians, it is a symbol of our people and our dance patterns that in legend, like the whaler's albatross, carries messages from island to island. In 1978, an Kiribati poet wrote, quote, the title of The Song of the Frigate Bird, verse that was eerily prophetic. The song is about a mother frigate bird who flies away to find food for her young. When she returns, her island is completely underwater and she can't find it anymore. Part of the verse is, I have no one to help me. I've been alone for so long. Rise up, you, the center of the world. Rise up from the depths of the sea so you may be seen from afar. Rise up, rise up. Melville never knew or imagined any of this. The first concerns of the global effects of atmospheric carbon were not raised until the 1890s, and sea level rise as a result of anthropogenic global warming wasn't in the public sphere until the 1960s. Yet this song is inseparable for me now when I read Moby-Dick. The skyhawk, the frigate bird, goes down, drowns with Tashtigo and the Pequod. Then another frigate bird hovers, leaving Ishmael in peace to float alone on the surface. So those are my sort of three big points that I wanted to share this evening about Melville's experience, about Melville's using Melville as a benchmark for our perception of the ocean, and kind of what 21st century interpretations of Moby-Dick might look like when we think about the ocean. And I'm certainly not the first to think of any of these ideas. The work that I did with Ahab Rolling Sea was really synthesizing the work of literally hundreds of extraordinary scholars, as well as poets and artists. And so this painting right here, I love, which was painted in response to Hurricane Katrina and the flooding. And so you can Orphan Avenue and Vortex, and that's Ahab's Folly Casino and a man floating on a coffin. So a formal thank you to everybody for listening, and for everyone inviting me here. And then I hope we have some time for some conversation and comments. And again, if we don't get to your questions tonight, this is my email right here, and I'd be delighted to hear from any of you. And then here's also my website. So maybe Dee, we could field some questions.
Yeah, Rich, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. There's only a couple up so far, but for the people who are listening, if you have questions and you open up your chat column, if you look at the menu bar at the bottom, you can type in questions. But so far we have one from Roger, and he asks, your thoughts about how we can best deal with the existing and future plastic waste pollution of our oceans. A recent story in the New Yorker of dives to the deepest areas of the oceans found evidence of plastic waste at these depths.
Yeah, you know, I'll speak at that from a literature historian point of view. And it's something that I talk about in Moby-Dick. And I think it actually does have relevance to Moby-Dick because you know, when we go to sea on ships like the Robert C. Siemens or the Korth Kramer, it's, and these vessels have really been at the forefront of looking at plastic pollution because we have such a long-term data set of taking plankton nets and surface samples and looking at microplastics. But there is something about plastic at sea for all of us that is so existentially unnerving, right? And it is partly because of works like Moby-Dick and our history of the literature and art of the ocean that we have continued to perceive that space as wild and kind of beyond our reach. And we're sort of been hoping that, you know, well, all the things that we're perhaps doing wrong ashore, at least the sea is wild and untouched. And we're learning more and more, historians, oceanographers, archaeologists, all fields showing that we've been having an effect on, on the ocean for a long time, but our sort of perception of that effect has been lagging way behind. And so that experience of when you see that floating bucket, or more realistically, you're kind of a science student on a ship and then you see microplastics in a sample of a plankton net under the microscope, it's really quite existentially troubling. In terms of what we can do, I think it's the same, and I'm purely editorializing now and not representing any organization. When we're on the ships, we are taught to conserve, and many of us in our homes are trying to conserve and do small things and not use straws and reuse and have solar panels and have electric cars. And I think all of those things are really important and we're all doing our part. But again, I'm just editorializing, but there needs to be much larger systematic change if we're really going to make big differences, and that's going to happen politically.
Rich, we've got a couple more questions, but since I'm in control of asking the questions, I'm going to ask mine first. From remembering reading Moby-Dick as a high school student, and of course, as a 16-year-old thinking that was a horrible assignment, to then reading it from a different perspective as an adult many years later, and as an adult who spent a fair amount of time at sea. Do you find that your students have read Moby-Dick in high school, or is that off the curriculum?
Yeah. I do not think too many students have read it in high school, and although some have. And the one thing I agree, I think there are some books that are pushed on you a little too early that you're not ready for. But then I have heard from people that said they read it when they were in high school and it just hit them at the right time. But it does always make me sad when I hear that instructors are assigning the novel, but pulling out kind of a lot of the marine biology middle parts, because I think it is really important to kind of what Melville's doing through Ishmael to kind of build that whole body of work.
All right, I'll let somebody else have a chance. We have a question from Luliati, and he says, actually, I'm having trouble reading it, but it says, good discussion, suggestion, Roger. Would you think we could include better garbage disposal within the larger discussion? And you've kind of already touched on that. So why don't we hold off and jump to Susan Wallace? And she says, do you mention in your book about the father of oceanography, Maury, and his compilation of these whalemen's logs to create the first data sets of whale behavior as a science?
Yeah, I do. And that's something that Melville references directly in the chapter of the chart. And there are sort of two sources. Well, let me step back. So the whole premise of the novel, right, is that Ahab can try to find a single whale in the middle of the entire ocean, which is a little bit absurd. And so in order to kind of build the sort of realism to that very narrative, Melville spends some time looking at what was known about whale migrations and whale regions. And so Melville references Matthew Fontaine Maury, who is putting together a now very famous whale map, which Melville didn't see. He saw kind of some excerpts of it and would have seen probably a newspaper flyer that was explaining it. And then he also read more carefully Charles Wilkes' account that kind of lays out all of the known whaling grounds at the time, as well as what was thought about whale migration in terms of sperm whales and right whales, the two major groups of whales that the whalemen were hunting.
I'm going to skip around just so we can try to keep the conversation fluid, because some more pertain to recent questions. So Jean asks that Melville spoke of large pods of whales, and are there still large pods of whales today, and what would their relative sizes be in comparison to the ones from his time?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that. And one interesting sort of broader thing is that how do we know? Who's out there now looking for large pods of sperm whales? Not too many people in the same way. There isn't the kind of money to send a small boat out to kind of zigzag across the equator for 6 months, and so there are some small sailboats that are going out there. There are oceanography vessels, but they've got a whole different noise level, a whole different cruise track, a whole different type of sampling strategy. And so actually vessels like ours can do some of that work. But people like Tony Wu, that photographer, he's quite interested in knowing where those big pods are, and he still has observed them, but he's quite interested to hear about those historical ones. And so, any kind of global estimate of whale population is difficult to do unless it's whales like the North Atlantic right whale or humpbacks, that we have a little bit more of a more consistent migration understanding that we can look at those whales. I can share one really intriguing story with Tony too, that I don't think he would mind me sharing this. When I was printing that photograph, I said, "Hey Tony, can you tell me where that is exactly?" And he said, "Actually, I can't really, because if I tell you exactly where that is, then there are going to be all these scuba divers that are going to want to go, and all this tourist traffic that are going to want to go and find these big pods." And so trying to conserve these areas where large sperm whales are still transiting in large numbers is of conservation interest. And I talk more about in Ahab's Rolling Sea about what Melville understood about how these large pods were changing their behavior in response to human hunting. And so modern day researchers are also looking at how family pods, particularly with sperm whales that tend to be matriarchal, are shifting based on what other noise pressures, habitat pressures, various ways that sperm whales seem to be adjusting their behavior in response to humans.
Here's a question from Raymond Mann that I'm going to add on to it a little bit. He says, what can be and what is being done today to stop the whaling in the Southern Ocean by Asian countries? And I guess to me, that brings back to when you were talking about how different cultures perceive, and you have, First Peoples that are still allowed to whale, get certain numbers a year, and so yeah, there's the famous Japanese whaling ships and Greenpeace, and anyway, so that's your question, is about where we are with that, and what can be done to do that, and should we?
Yeah, as you suggested, those are really prickly diplomatic questions, and how much one nation can tell another nation what to do in terms of resources. But then, of course, when a resource is on the high seas, who has jurisdiction over that? And it's always been an agreement. And I think since the whale moratorium in the late 1980s, that whale populations do seem to be improving. And so if you're kind of looking for good environmental stories, the great whales are not back, to historical levels. And that's one of those things, like, how many whales were there in 1850? What are we trying to get back to? And so there are a lot of great historians and biologists trying to model what those things look like. But most species, and we'll take the North Atlantic right whale out of that, and the North Pacific right whale, and the gray whale, most of the species since the international moratorium are generally trending upwards and getting better, and there are different localized populations. And so I'm not going to suggest that, don't worry about whales, everything's fine. But whether how to respond to other nations hunting those whales, or even indigenous Americans hunting whales, it's a really intriguing question.
We have a couple questions that actually bring us back to the book, Melville's book, not yours. I mean, yes, yours. Brian asks that a question about when the book was published. It was not well received until after World War I, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, and so exactly like you said, it kind of bombed when it came out, and Melville kind of really never recovered. He'd been kind of on the way down with other novels, and then he turned to poetry pretty soon afterwards. There were some fans, he did have enthusiasts and people that appreciated his work, during his lifetime and through the turn of the century. But then there was this big, a lot of people refer to it as a Melville Revival in the 1920s, post-World War I. And I think there are a couple factors. The publishing of these two biographies came out, which brought some attention to Melville. But I think there's also the very format of Moby-Dick, how it's just, it's kind of very modernist, with, like a Joyce or Virginia Woolf, are really playing with storytelling and narrative. And so I think it found an audience that appreciated the experimentalness of the novel, as well as the themes of, of trauma, and someone who, had come back from a war, and we saw what humans could do to our own species after war, and how we could apply that to a big metaphor like the sea voyage after a single whale and Ahab.
I'm going to go back to a question I skipped earlier. Robert, I think it's Ditchy, asks, what other works of Melville do you find as interesting as Moby-Dick?
Yeah, I tend to be, I like his earlier work. So Taipei and Omu are really interesting about those are first two books, and those were the ones that were really the most popular. And those are kind of part sea story, part autobiography, travel writing, about sea voyage narratives about going to the South Pacific and his time at sea. I think Redburn is a really intriguing book about his transatlantic voyage, even though he cranked that novel out. I think it's like 6 weeks or something absurd. White Jacket is really interesting too, in thinking about the US Navy, and his descriptions of Cape Horn I really like. And then Mardy's a little bit of a slow read, I'm not going to lie, but in terms of his describing the equatorial Pacific and working through some of his ideas about natural history and authority, I like Mardy too. And some of his later poems I quite like as well.
Now we have a question from our trustee and vice chair, Rick Lopes, who asked two-part question. One, in your research, did you come across Melville writing about basque whalers and the Cape Verde Islands? And two, how do you or should we place a historical perspective on whaling with respect to today's norms and values?
Yeah, with the first one, I'm trying to think. There's the famous forecastle scene where there's all these different sailors from all nations which are celebrating on the forecastle. And I think there's a Cape Verdean sailor in there, but I could be wrong. But I don't remember him talking about the history of Basque whaling, if you're thinking about like coming over and whaling off the coast of the Canadian Maritimes and New England in the sort of early contact years. In terms of the second one, I think, just like Ishmael as a climate refugee, it's always an interesting task, and some people quite object to saying, all right, well, you can't take present day values and read a book that was written 150 years ago and read it in the same way. And I tend to go against that. I think that stories, like any story that lives for a long time, continually gets reinterpreted and re-understood. And we think about, or at least for me, I like to think about a book like Moby-Dick as an artifact, as like, okay, this is one person's point of view. And I think it's a really representative one because he had done so much reading as well as done it himself. And Melville, in some ways, is really quite ahead of his time in terms of whales. Like, he really shows all these different points of view. And there is even a moment in the novel where he gets inside the head of a whale, and he shows empathy for a whale, and he shows kind of the gore of this experience, and it being wasteful. But often when during that wasteful aspect, he turns that back to the consumer and says, hey, it's your demand that's driving this. And so I think there's a lot to be gained from taking a 21st century perspective and thinking about what we know now or think that we know or perceive, and compare that to how this has changed. And the last thing I would say is it's pretty extraordinary when you think about how quickly the American perception of whales has changed. You think about a 19-year-old standing at the rail of the Acushnet of the Charles W. Morgan in the 1850s, and how extraordinarily different that experience of seeing a whale is to someone 2020 looking over the rail and seeing a whale.
I can't remember, I'm just going to add on to this. I can't remember the title, but there was a book that came out probably 15, 20 years ago about the whaling Weiss journals. It's a big coffee table book. Remember that?
Whaling Wives?
Yeah, that's it. Anyway, maybe not. Anyway, there's a scene in it when I was sailing on a semester at sea into the Sea of Cortez and up the west side of Baja California, and we went into Magdalena Bay where the gray whales are there with their calves. And we were reading a whaling wife's diary entry that talks about that the whale ships would come into those shallow bays where the gray whales come in with their calf or to calve. And she describes them chasing a mother and a calf, and how the mother whale is pushing the calf to go faster to get away from the whaleboat. And you read that and you're just like, there is just no way that they didn't know that there was a mother-child relationship going on with, for the people who just described them as fish and that they didn't have emotion and all that kind of thing. But you read that diary entry at the time and you're like, there is just no way you can say that they didn't know that, or at least that some of them didn't know that. I was very disturbed reading that part of her diary entry. I'm just going to say we've got a couple more questions we have time for. If we don't get time for your question, we're going to, if you can email them to Rich, he promised he will answer them. But I do have a couple more that here. We have a really interesting one from somebody whose name is a code, Murph something, but he asks, or she asks, what, if any, is the relationship between Captain Ahab and with Ahab, king of Israel, chastised by Elijah in the Old Testament?
Yeah, you know, I'm not as good with the biblical references, but there's no question about Melville knew his Bible very, very well, and every name in the novel chosen really carefully, just like Ishmael. And so, and I think there's even a reference in the novel kind of referring to that biblical naming. So I would say yes, absolutely. Melville would have known that reference, particularly, you know, I would go to the King James Version of the Bible to look at what Melville would have read. And if you send me an email, I could send you directly to a source that would give you more information about that.
We have this is definitely in your book, but from Sarah Bramble writes, what can you share about Melville's relationships with his contemporaries of Thoreau and Emerson?
Yeah, you know, it's a pretty interesting thing to think about, because Melville came back in 1844, in the fall of 1844. He sails into Boston. He's just come back from this, you know, nearly 4-year epic voyage. And then, you know, just around that time, only 20 miles inland is, you know, that Thoreau guy who's just bought this or just kind of, you know, starting to build on Emerson's property around Walden Pond. And so they really are contemporaries. Melville in later life, you know, seems to kind of prod and poke the transcendentalists. We do have some records that Melville saw at least one speech, maybe it's a couple, I don't recall, of Emerson's, and he had some pretty interesting things to say about Emerson. And recognizing that Emerson was pretty out there and had some really wild ideas, but he felt that he appreciated Emerson, at least in this letter after seeing this lecture, for just diving deep, for just like being a philosopher and trying to go as deep as he could. And I use an Emerson quotation for the epigraph of Ahab's Rolling Sea to kind of talk about Emerson's interest in both the poetry and the dissection. And I think that was very much Melville's mission.
I think we're going to close with this one last question. And I know we didn't get to everybody. We have some good other questions about scrimshaw and historic preservation. So please make sure you see Rich's email and his website, which is up on that slide. His email is rking@sea.edu. If you somehow lose track of how to get in touch with him, you can always contact us at NMHS and we'll forward that on to you. But so the final question, which is a great one. It's from Jillian, and she says, in your research, did you find a correlation between the Pequod and the whale ship Essex? And had Melville read Chase's account?
Yeah, that it's a great question. There's no question that Melville had read Chase's account. It's definitely one of the big sources, and he does kind of do a little metatextual reference of Chase's account and the Essex within the novel through Ishmael. And I think, you know, you kind of take the Essex and then you take the story of the white whale Moby-Dick as kind of these two main historical strands that often get mixed up in kind of popular culture, and that Melville sort of weaves together to write Moby-Dick.
We're going to call that, close the question and answer now. And if everybody who wants to, well, first I just want to say thank you to Rich so much for doing this. This is our inaugural Charles Point Council or seminar series online. And so we appreciate people being a little bit patient with us as we sort of figure out the technology. But Rich, thanks so much. If you are not a regular reader of Animals and Sea History, they're all online right now. And if you can go to our website, you can click on every issue of Sea History is open. And Rich has been doing Animals and Sea History since, I think, what was the first one?
2006.
2006, and the first one was on barnacles. And I just read that again yesterday, and it says, we're going to do the first of a small series. So it's now 2020. One thing I'd also like to point out about Rich's contribution towards what NMHS strives to do, which is not just to preserve our maritime heritage, but to promote it, is that as an educator, he is just a champion of his students. And we have in Sea History on a number of occasions printed student written articles that Rich has, or written either with Rich or that he has stewarded along the way to help get into print, which is great to give students the opportunity to be published and to share with our readers sort of the current research that's going underway or people's experiences and thoughts from that. So that is something we really value. And I'm thrilled anytime you have a student paper you think can be adapted to a regular magazine article. So we're going to open this up to questions. Oh, actually, I wanted to say one more thing, or Jessica asked me to say one more thing. As we, as a society, and with both the capital S as an NMHS, and as our society as a whole, figure out how we're navigating this COVID-19, we don't know when we'll be able to return to live in-person events. So if you could just pay attention to your emails, we'll let you know when things are going on, and make sure you visit our website if you can. We're posting a lot of links of other museums and institutions, online efforts, and there's more content than I have ever seen that has, you know, you think that's being thrown together all in the last couple months, that it might be patchy, but it's remarkable what some of the maritime heritage organizations are doing online. And you can find a lot of those links on the Sea History website or the National Maritime Historical Society website, which is www.seahistory.org. And so right now, if anybody wants to, instead of having a coffee hour or a cocktail hour where we can all mingle, if you want, we're going to try to have everybody unmute yourself if you want, and you can chit chat with each other, and hopefully we won't have 50 people talking over one another, but we'll give that a shot for a little while. And if it doesn't go well, we'll call it a night. And if it goes well, we'll keep things going. But Rich, thank you so much.